It's a scene many have lived through, though not quite in the way Conor McGregor did. You walk into a room expecting recognition. You've worked hard, built yourself up, created an identity that commands attention, but then you're denied. Not ignored, denied, refused service, rejected. And not because you did anything wrong, but because who you are isn't enough in that moment. When McGregor was reportedly denied service at a restaurant, it was more than a media headline. It was an emotional symbol. For anyone who has ever carried pride into a room and left with bruised dignity, the situation taps something deep. And what he did next, what surprised everyone, wasn't about a fight. It was about something more vulnerable. Something we don't often allow ourselves to feel, much less express publicly. We live in a society that tells us, especially men, especially as we age, that our value is tied to how we're perceived. By the waiter, the room, the crowd. In American culture, identity is so often built on performance, your job title, your wealth, your reputation. By the time we reach our 40s, 50s, or 60s, we've curated an entire self around these external validations. And yet, one moment of rejection can bring it all into question. The older we get, the more quietly we ask, what am I without my status? McGregor may seem like an unlikely mirror for this reflection, but the psychology behind the incident is universal. Beneath the celebrity and bravado is a man with the same raw nerve we all carry, a need to be seen, respected, and acknowledged. When that doesn't happen, something ancient in us flinches. Public rejection is different. It isn't just personal, it's performative. And when it happens in front of others, especially when you're known, it scrapes against our deepest fears of being diminished, of losing relevance, of no longer mattering. But here's the twist. What shocked everyone wasn't that McGregor reacted, it's how he reacted. Because it revealed something many midlife adults quietly understand. There comes a time when power is less about force and more about restraint. By midlife, status becomes more than just a social ranking. It becomes a part of how we navigate the world. For many Americans over 45, the pursuit of status isn't about vanity, it's about security, respect. Proof that all the sacrifices of time, of youth, of emotional labor meant something. Conor McGregor is a master of performance, and whether one admires or criticizes him, there's no denying this. His public identity is a finely tuned projection of strength, control, and dominance. But being denied service, particularly in a public space, challenges that entire persona. It forces a moment of existential reckoning. If I am not who I thought I was here, then where else might that identity unravel? This is not exclusive to celebrities. In fact, it's something many people feel in more subtle but equally powerful ways. Imagine a man who spent decades building his career, only to be replaced by someone younger. Or a woman whose children no longer seem to need her in the same way. These are quiet rejections, small denials of the identity we once held with pride. The American cultural landscape often ties worth to usefulness, and as people move into their 50s and beyond, they begin to sense this implicit shift from being central to being peripheral. It's no longer enough to have been important. You must still prove you are. And so when someone like McGregor is publicly denied, the emotional weight of that moment echoes loudly for anyone who's felt their relevance questioned. Psychologist Erik Erikson described the midlife stage as a conflict between generativity and stagnation. It's a period where we want to create, contribute, and be respected. Rejection, then, isn't just about being refused a meal or a seat. It's about feeling pushed toward irrelevance. What McGregor's response reminds us is that how we handle rejection says more about our inner strength than our outer reputation. And maybe, just maybe, the most powerful thing a person can do is not lash out, but pause, reflect, and respond from a deeper place. Because when the world denies you, it's tempting to shout back. But true maturity, earned over decades, is knowing that silence can be louder than noise. To understand what happened in that restaurant, we have to talk about masculinity. Not the performative kind, but the internalized expectations that many men, particularly those over 45 in the United States, carry like invisible armor. McGregor, in many ways, embodies the hypermasculine ideal, physically dominant, assertive, unfiltered. But beneath that exterior lies a more universal experience, what psychologists call the fragile ego. Not because it's weak, but because it's built from a lifetime of being told that emotion equals weakness, and vulnerability invites defeat. Men in American culture are often taught to be providers, protectors, pillars of control. But what happens when that control is taken away, even momentarily, by a simple refusal of service? It's not about the meal, it's about the message. You are not in charge here. And for many men, that's where the deepest emotional injury occurs, not in the event itself, but in what it represents. Midlife masculinity is complex. On one hand, a man has lived enough to know he can survive. On the other, he often carries decades of unexpressed pressure to stay strong, keep earning, hold everything together. Rejection cuts through that, not because it harms his body, but because it threatens his identity. And it's not just public figures. Think of the father whose adult children don't call as often, or the worker who trained his replacement, or the husband whose silence at the dinner table speaks volumes about lost dreams. These aren't dramatic outbursts, they're quiet, chronic wounds. McGregor's public restraint in this case, his choice not to explode, was surprising because it contrasted with the persona many expected. But maybe that's the point. Perhaps even the loudest men come to realize that raw power isn't about proving dominance. Sometimes it's about not needing to. True masculinity, in its most evolved form, isn't about control. It's about grace under humiliation. And for many aging men in a society that often moves on without them, that's the lesson that comes too late, unless we name it now. The wound of pride is real, but so is the power of humility. There's a fear that quietly settles in as we age, one that isn't often named but deeply felt, the fear of becoming invisible. For many Americans in midlife and beyond, it's not death they fear most, it's irrelevance. Being passed over, not seen, not heard. What happened to Conor McGregor in that restaurant wasn't just a denial, it was a stripping away of the usual spotlight. And that stings, not just for a public figure, but for anyone who spent decades being somebody and suddenly feels like they're fading into the background. This feeling isn't reserved for celebrities. It's the mother who no longer gets asked for advice, the employee who watches younger colleagues get promoted, the man whose phone is quieter than it used to be. It's subtle, slow, and cumulative. And it cuts deep. American culture glorifies youth, the new, the next. So when someone who has built a legacy is no longer prioritized, whether in a restaurant or a relationship, it triggers something primal. Am I still needed? Am I still seen? Psychologists call this role loss. Over time, we outgrow or are pushed out of roles that once defined us: parent of young children, worker, leader, caretaker. And unless we find new meaning, we risk drifting into emotional isolation. That invisibility isn't about eyesight, it's about significance. When McGregor didn't retaliate with violence or spectacle, it offered something rare, a moment of restraint that allowed space for reflection. Because what shocked people wasn't the refusal of service, it was that a man known for fighting didn't fight. And in doing so, he mirrored something many people in midlife experience: a shift from reaction to contemplation. Invisibility isn't always external. Sometimes it begins within. We start to believe our moment has passed, that we're no longer in the room where things happen. But that's not truth, it's a story. And like any story, it can be rewritten. Being denied attention doesn't mean we've lost value. It means we're invited to find it elsewhere, internally, quietly, with a different kind of strength. The modern self, especially in the Western world, is often constructed externally. We are taught to become someone worth recognizing through achievement, visibility, legacy. And for much of our adult lives, that pursuit feels natural. But there comes a moment, often in midlife, when we're forced to ask, what remains of me when the applause stops? Conor McGregor's entire public identity is built on being recognized, not just noticed, but acknowledged as powerful, relevant, victorious. When someone like him is denied service, it's not merely inconvenient, it's existential. It threatens the foundation of a persona designed to dominate the room. But this same tension exists in the everyday lives of countless people over 45. We may not have cameras following us, but we've built our lives on the quiet reinforcement of being needed, respected, or admired by family, co-workers, friends. When those affirmations fade, even slowly, we begin to question who we are without them. This is especially true in American culture, where identity is often bound to productivity and public image. We are not just ourselves, we are what others see. And so, when visibility fades, we are left confronting the parts of us that never got developed. Our internal voice, our self-worth, our quieter truths. There's a deep psychological risk here. If we don't build an identity rooted in internal meaning, we become overly dependent on how others treat us. A denial at a restaurant, a dismissal at work, or even a child's indifference can unravel us emotionally. Not because of the act itself, but because we've linked our worth to recognition. What McGregor's moment reminds us is that real identity can't be held hostage by others' validation. His restraint hinted, however briefly, at a possible shift, one that many of us must make as we age, moving from external affirmation to internal alignment. Who we are has to mean more than who sees us, because if the world turns away, and at some point it will, we need to know there's still something steady within us, a version of ourselves that doesn't disappear when no one's watching. Humiliation is one of the most destabilizing human emotions, not just because it hurts, but because it exposes our lack of control. And in American society, where personal autonomy is deeply cherished, losing control in public feels like the ultimate failure. When McGregor was denied service, what occurred wasn't violent or dramatic, yet it stirred fascination precisely because it represented a loss of control for someone who is almost always in command. For decades, we've watched him win, roar, dominate. But that night, someone else said no. And in that no, the illusion cracked. This mirrors a truth that many midlife adults confront, sometimes quietly, sometimes painfully. We cannot control how others perceive us. We cannot always steer outcomes, conversations, or relationships the way we once did or thought we could. Parents lose control over grown children. Professionals lose influence in industries evolving without them. Even our bodies begin to defy us. And the more we try to grasp, the more life reminds us that control was never as solid as it seemed. Psychologists often speak of the narrative self, the story we tell ourselves about who we are. But public humiliation disrupts that story. It introduces a version of us that doesn't match the image we've worked so hard to project. And that gap between how we see ourselves and how others treat us can create a psychological rupture. But what McGregor's reaction subtly suggests is this: control might not be about domination, but about choosing how to respond when the script falls apart. That's the mature shift. That's the growth many people begin to feel, often after 45, when the need to prove is gradually replaced by the need to understand. In a younger man, public humiliation may provoke anger, retaliation, chaos. But in a man shaped by years of both success and failure, it can become a catalyst for humility, for self-inquiry, for reinvention. Control is a myth, but self-mastery, that's real. And it begins when we stop trying to rewrite how others see us and start rewriting how we relate to ourselves. In a world that equates reaction with relevance, silence is often misunderstood, especially in American culture, where being vocal, assertive, and dominant is frequently seen as power. Choosing not to react can be perceived as weakness. But in truth, silence is often a form of strength, especially in midlife when one has nothing left to prove. When Conor McGregor chose not to escalate the situation, it surprised people, not because they expected violence per se, but because they expected something, a performance, a retort, a reminder of who he is. But instead there was stillness. And in that stillness, something powerful happened. Dignity emerged. For people over 45, this kind of emotional restraint often becomes more familiar, not because the feelings go away. Anger, shame, frustration, they're still there. But the need to act on them changes. We begin to realize that not every slight requires a war. Not every bruise needs to be made visible. This is the wisdom of age. Not just enduring life's blows, but learning how to respond in a way that protects your peace. Silence in this context is not avoidance, it's discernment. It's the conscious decision to value one's inner stability over temporary dominance. There's also something else that silence does. It forces others to sit with their actions. When someone lashes out, we can easily shift the blame back onto them. But when someone responds with grace, we're left to face our own behavior. That's why silence can feel so uncomfortable. It holds up a mirror. McGregor's restraint was a deviation from the script people expected. But maybe that's why it spoke so loudly. It mirrored something deeper, the quiet power that comes when a person is no longer ruled by their ego. In midlife, many people find themselves rethinking the role of pride, the utility of confrontation, and the cost of constantly defending one's image. And in that rethinking, silence begins to feel like a sanctuary, a place where dignity is preserved not through what we say, but what we choose not to. Sometimes the loudest proof of power is the choice to remain still. There's a quiet shift that happens as we grow older, one that challenges everything we were taught about power. In youth, power is loud. It's about presence, charisma, control. But after 45, real power begins to look different, more internal, more intentional, and less about what others see. Conor McGregor's public image is one of force. But in that brief moment of refusal, when he didn't react with fury or entitlement, he demonstrated something rare, the beginning of a new kind of power, the kind that doesn't need to be proven. For many Americans in midlife, this is a critical psychological pivot. We begin to sense that the tools we once used to navigate the world, dominance, competitiveness, constant assertion, no longer serve us in the same way. They become exhausting. And more importantly, they become hollow. Psychologist Carl Jung spoke of the second half of life as a time when the ego, once necessary for survival, begins to give way to deeper truths. We no longer need to win every conversation. We no longer need to dominate every room. Instead, we start seeking meaning, connection, legacy. This transition isn't easy. It often begins with a loss of a job, of a role, of recognition. But it's in these moments of perceived diminishment that the seeds of real power are planted. Because when we are no longer driven by proving our worth, we finally become free to be. McGregor's restraint in that restaurant, whether intentional or instinctive, symbolized this shift. It asked a question that many in midlife wrestle with. What if power isn't about being served, but about choosing how to serve yourself emotionally? The older we get, the more we realize that reactions cost us something: time, energy, peace. And so we begin to spend those resources more carefully. We start protecting our attention, choosing our battles and letting more things go, not out of weakness but wisdom. In this light, the denial McGregor experienced wasn't a defeat. It was an invitation, one that many of us will face, to stop measuring power by what we can control and start measuring it by how deeply we understand ourselves. In the end, no headlines will capture the full weight of what happened that evening, not for McGregor, and not for those who saw themselves in his silence. What looked like a denial of service was, in truth, a confrontation with identity, relevance, and the deeper question we all face: who am I when the world no longer applauds? That question hits harder with age. Not because we've failed, but because we've already lived. We've poured decades into families, careers, communities, and somewhere along the way, we hoped, quietly, that this would protect us from irrelevance, that recognition would last. But the world moves fast, faster than many of us can follow. The true victory then isn't in reclaiming the spotlight. It's in stepping out of it without losing ourselves. McGregor's moment reminds us that not every battle worth fighting happens in the ring. Some happen in the quiet after a rejection, in the space between pride and grace. And these battles are deeply familiar to anyone over 45 who's been overlooked, replaced, or underestimated. But midlife is not the beginning of decline, it's the beginning of redefinition. We begin to understand that our worth is not transactional, that even if we are denied, we are not diminished. That dignity doesn't depend on how others treat us. It lives in how we choose to respond. This is the psychology of mature identity, the movement from reaction to reflection, from ego to essence. So what McGregor did next, what shocked everyone, was not just holding back. It was stepping into a new kind of presence, one that doesn't need to be loud to be felt, one that speaks not to fans, but to the self. In that way, maybe we all have something to learn from this moment. Not about fame, not about spectacle, but about how to carry ourselves when no one is watching. How to choose dignity in a world that often forgets to offer it. And maybe that's the final truth. The most important victories are the ones no one sees. At some point in life, we stop chasing respect and begin to embody it. That's the deeper lesson behind McGregor's moment. Not just about restraint or public perception, but about internal authority. The kind that isn't shaken by a denied table or a closed door. Because when we rely on the world to validate us, we live in constant negotiation. But when we choose to respect ourselves, consistently, quietly, we step into something unshakable. Many people past midlife know this truth intimately. They've learned that respect can't be demanded. It has to be lived. It's in how you carry yourself, how you treat others, how you respond when things don't go your way. And it's especially in how you manage disappointment without letting it define you. McGregor didn't lose anything that night. In fact, he gained something rare in today's world, the right to be seen differently, not just as a fighter, but as a man aware of the weight of his presence. And maybe that's the invitation for all of us, to stop performing for validation, to let go of the constant pressure to be seen and start anchoring in what we know to be true about ourselves. Because real respect doesn't come from approval. It comes from alignment between who we are and how we show up. And in that space, even rejection becomes a form of redirection toward a self we no longer have to prove.